Moin, ich bin Jenna Liberatore und heute lesen ich viel aus meinem Buch Ties That Bind. Das geht zwei Wesenkanner, die an den Morgen, die zusammen groß gehen an Irland, Anfang vom 20. Jahrhundert, und die an ihrem Leben ganz verschiedene Wege werden ausschlagen. Prologue. August 1908. The waves rolled in on a gentle breeze and crashed against the rocky beach, retreating in a gurgling sound and cresting between the slate-grey boulders. Sunbeams caressed the surface of the ocean, making it sparkle like 1,000 diamonds. The sea mirrored itself in her soft brown eyes, which were the color of freshly churned earth. Morgan gazed at the young girl and contemplated her for a long moment. Her dark lashes fluttered as she stared out onto the water. The corner of her lips were slightly tilted up in a dreamy smile. Her nose was sprinkled with freckles, and her cheeks were flushed from the cool, salty breeze. A strand of her fox-red hair curled behind her ear and traced the gentle curve of her slender neck. He would never forget the way she looked in that moment. Sadie. She turned to him and smiled, revealing the space between her two upper front teeth. When she noticed the earnest expression in Morgan's eyes, her face fell. Sadie studied him and found that he looked serious. She shuddered. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed. He did not answer, but a sad smile flew across his mouth and passed as quickly as the shadow of a moving cloud. How could he tell her? They had spent their entire childhood together, growing up in an orphanage in Dublin. Neither of them remembered a time before that. Neither of them knew where they came from. It had always been just the two of them. Friends had come and gone, but Sadie had always been there. Morgan stared into the young girl's big eyes. They were so full of questions and uncertainty, so full of dread, that his stomach formed into a knot and he felt suddenly sick. "I'm leaving." His voice came out husky. Sadie frowned, trying to grasp the essence of his sentence. For a moment she thought he was joking, but she had never seen him so grave. Why? She wanted to know, her gaze searching his. "You know why." She shook her head, tears now stinging her eyes. Morgan's gaze hardened. "They'll send me off anyway. When I turn 16 in November, I will be put in some household and forced to work as a slave for the rest of me days." "Not a slave," Sadie replied, with a note of mock in her voice. "An apprentice." Morgan snorted. "'Tis the same to me. I'll be dependent on other people's goodwill me whole life." She stared at him incredulously. "'Tis how it's meant to be. We don't have a choice in this. 'Tis the only way for us to be provided for." "We always have a choice," Morgan spat out in an outburst of emotion. "I choose to leave and find my own path, not follow one that has been laid out for me." He watched her fight the urge to cry as she stubbornly fixed the ocean, where in the distance a sailing boat glided along the horizon. Two seagulls drew circles in the cerulean sky, their white coat gleaming in the sun. Down on the beach, someone was flying a kite. For a while they both contemplated it as it quivered in the wind, propelled high into the air, only to drop like a stone the next moment. "We have talked about this before," Morgan added quietly. "You know how I feel." Sadie blinked away her tears, but could not prevent one from rolling down her cheek. "But where will you go?" Morgan shrugged. "Don't know yet." She turned to him. When she realized that this was the end of the conversation for him, Sadie jumped to her feet and shouted, "You can't just leave!" Her hands were balled into fists. The skirts of her green dress fluttered and her wild hair flew into her face. Her eyes were defiant. Morgan glared at her impatiently. "I have to do this," he replied, a little harsher than he had intended to. She tensed up and her shoulders heaved as she breathed in heavily. The seagulls had parted, and while one settled on the beach and started picking at empty seashells left there by the tide, the second bird flew away. "Then go," Sadie said bitterly. Morgan flinched at the tone of her voice. He had expected her to cry, beg him to stay or, as he had hoped for, ask him to take her with him. In a way, her reaction made his decision easier. He felt the urge to pull her towards him and kiss her. He had never done that before, even though he had been wanting to for some time now. A yearning spread inside of him, starting in the pit of his stomach and threatening to take possession of him, but he stifled it forcefully. In that moment, he recognized that Sadie was only still a child, and a child standing before him put all her energy into pouting because he saw things differently, as she did. Morgan felt suddenly sad that she did not realize that they might never see each other again. He could not tell her how he felt. He wouldn't, not like this. Maybe it was better this way. Morgan got to his feet and walked away without a word. Sadie ran her fingers through her hair and studied herself in the mirror. Hayden had not liked her dress, but now, as he entered the bedroom to announce that the first guests had arrived, he was astounded by his wife's appearance. Her hair comb matched the necklace he had bought for her 17th birthday. The blue dress contrasted her milky skin and fiery hair. She looked like a vision, and he knew she would draw everyone's attention. Music floated up the staircase, mingled with the soft murmur of voices and occasional laughter. People were standing in small groups, holding a cup of champagne and chattering lightly. They all stopped and stared in awe as Sadie came down the stairs. The young girl's shy smile and the excited twinkle in her soft brown eyes added to her frail and juvenile appearance. Sadie soaked up her surroundings in fascination. The staff had done a wonderful job in decorating the hallway with fresh flowers and putting up 4 chandeliers to add a warm glow to the artificial light from the appliances. The band had been set up on the landing between the first and second floor, so that the guests had the hallway to themselves. Hayden made the rounds with his new wife and introduced Sadie to all of his friends and acquaintances, with his chin proudly lifted. The young girl enjoyed the attention and basked in the many compliments and admiring gazes she earned. Waiters streamed from the kitchen, carrying trays of champagne and cordial, and later circulated through the guests offering appetizers. These were so delicious that Sadie ended up trailing after the waiters. She did not realize that Hayden was not by her side anymore until she turned round to ask him when dinner would be served. The young girl found herself standing at the other end of the hall, near the ballroom where they would go to dance after dinner, and was not sure what to do. She searched for her husband when her eyes fell on a young man approaching her. Sadie froze, thinking that it would be impolite to withdraw now that she had seen him coming towards her. He smiled at her when he closed up with her. "You look a bit lost," the man remarked. "Well, I just realized my appetite was so big I lost my husband over it." The young man laughed heartily. "Maybe we will find him." He offered her his arm, but Sadie only stared at it with a confused expression. "How silly of me." The stranger took her hand and kissed the back, tickling her skin with his mustache. "I'm Julian Dean. It was a pleasure meeting you, Mrs. King. Maybe we'll see each other again someday." She smiled feebly and watched him return to the group of men he had been talking to. She could tell by his accent that he was British, as Hayden, and he distinguished himself from his companions by his elegant appearance and a gracefulness she did not find in the other men. When Sadie set out in search of her husband, she noticed him standing apart, talking in an intent and familiar way with an elderly woman. Julian Dean's gaze fell on her, and he glanced in the direction she was looking at, then raised his voice. "Gentlemen, let us drink up to Mrs. King." Sadie turned to him in surprise and raised her brows. "May she have a happy life with her new husband." The men looked at their hostess and nodded before drinking up. Sadie smiled shyly. "We were just discussing Italian wine," Julian explained. "Oh? While I myself prefer that particular wine, my friends here argue that French wine tastes more exquisitely." The region of Tuscany is most notable for its wine, Sadie put in, remembering an article she had read in one of Haydn's magazines, and astounded everyone. A certain Ricasoli imported different varieties of grapes from France and Germany in the 19th century, but he discovered that the local varieties produced the best wine. "Why, look at that," one of the men gushed. "Haydn, your wife seems to know a thing or two about wine. Maybe you should buy her a vineyard in Italy." Sadie turned around and her smile froze when she saw the sour expression on her husband's face. His cheeks were crimson and his jade-green eyes had turned dark. He gripped her arm. "Forgive my wife's intrusion, gentlemen. She has no sense of proper conduct. I have yet to teach her." His grip hardened as he dragged her away. Sadie tried to conceal her embarrassment. When they were out of hearing distance from the men, she looked up at him and said, "You're hurting me. I wasn't doing anything wrong." "A woman has no place standing with men discussing wine," Haydn muttered. "I just saw you standing with a woman," Sadie retorted. Haydn stopped and glowered at her. The wild expression in his eyes made her shiver. "Don't count on me. This ball is for you. I want you to make friends with at least some of the women here, lest you end up sitting in the kitchen with our maids." Haydn left his wife with a group of unseemly women, who all looked at her as if she were a new doll in their collection. However, when they realized that she was clumsy and answered their questions reluctantly, feeling like a shy animal ready to pounce at any second, the women continued their chit-chat regardless of her. Sadie was, however, too insecure to leave the group, so she let her eyes wander across the room until they caught the attention of a tall, dark-haired woman. The stranger stood apart from the crowd, a nonchalant expression on her face, and quietly sipped her champagne, a cigarette in a holder casually balancing in her other hand. The woman wore a long, tight-fitting dress, which was just to Sadie's taste, and her hair was cut short, almost like a man's. Sadie stared at her in fascination. "Who is that?" she asked one of her companions. The women turned to look in the direction Sadie rested her gaze and crumpled their noses. "That's Countess Markievicz. Have you heard of her?" "Nay." "Well," one of them said in a low voice and leaned closer to Sadie. "Her family owned land here in Ireland, just like her husband. Her father was a dumb man, way too good to his tenants." The woman's tone was disdainful. "Countess Markievicz joined the political party and the Daughters of Ireland," another told Sadie in a hushed voice. "And she even founded a school for boys and girls, where pupils are taught to use firearms." The woman snorted. "Can you imagine? And all of that just because of a sense for patriotism. What does she think, that she will rile up those children and have them chase us back to England?" The women snickered meanly. "I'm telling you, the Countess is trouble. We keep away from her as much as possible. You should too." Sadie studied the stranger curiously, and just then the Countess met her gaze. Sadie felt electrified. She did not smile, but cocked her head as her eyes fixed the young girl. "Come now, let's ignore her before she comes over," Sadie's companion quickly put in and turned her around. Dinner was announced at 8:30. The guests streamed into the dining hall, which to Sadie seemed vast in a surreal way, but she overheard someone note that it was by far smaller than dining rooms usually found at estates belonging to men like Haydn King. When Sadie moved on, she discovered that Haydn was already sitting at one end of the table, with both spots next to him already taken. The young girl froze and looked about her helplessly until the maid appeared at her side. "Mrs. King," she whispered, "you are sitting at the other end of the table." Sadie's face blanched. "But I thought I would sit next to my husband." The maid shook her head. Sadie walked to her seat with her shoulders slumped and scrutinized the guests taking their places around her with big eyes. She did not know any of them, but they all seemed to know her and looked at her with interest, as if she were an animal from a faraway country they saw for the first time. Sadie sat down and wished she could disappear beneath the table. She kneaded the tablecloth between her fingers as she smiled self-consciously and endured the formal introductions. When the waiters came to clear the table after the first course, everyone in a radius of 5 people, to her left and right, turned their attention on the new Mrs. King. "Tell me, dear, which school did you attend again? Did you go to art school? Hayden barely talks about your background," a woman whose long name Sadie had forgotten inquired. The young girl swallowed and suddenly felt hot. I didn't attend any school." The women sucked in their breath, and some of the men raised their brows in surprise. "Beg your pardon?" the woman said, and she seemed as though she would suffer a fit any second. "My parents both died when I was little," Sadie explained. "I never had the chance to go to school. I grew up in an orphanage." "Oh." The woman's husband smiled emphatically while his wife demonstratively folded a napkin and placed it on the table silently. Sadie's eyes wandered to the others, who stared into their glasses, embarrassed. "Why, isn't it lucky that orphanages exist and take care of the future of the unlucky?" one of the men put in. "Certainly," another agreed, turning to his wife and nodding encouragingly. "Poor children," the latter exclaimed. "I, for my part, donate to our local orphanage once a year." Sadie almost immediately felt the change towards her. Her guests stopped involving her in their conversation. She suffered through dinner and had no interest in mingling with anyone else, so when people retreated to the drawing rooms and the ballroom, Sadie slipped into her husband's study, which seemed to be the only room no one would go in. She was lounging by the open window, reading a book, when Hayden opened the door and peeked inside. "Sadie, what are you doing here?" "Hiding," the young girl replied sullenly. Hayden closed the door and frowned. "What is the matter with you?" He chose to ignore the desperate expression veiling her eyes. "Why did you marry me?" Sadie's voice had taken a desperate edge. "Excuse me?" "I'm not like those other women I met tonight. They all attended school or had fancy classes of some sort. They belong to the upper class, while I—" "Oh, you sweet girl," Hayden said quietly and touched his wife's cheek. "Don't worry about all that. I know you lack in education, but you will catch up. I am going to find you a private tutor this fall, and he will teach you everything you want. Arts, music, French." Sadie's mouth opened, and she gaped at him incredulously. Hayden took her hand and pulled her to her feet. "Come now, it's impolite for the host to skip their own party." The young girl did not move and instead drew him to her. "Hayden, please, I don't want to go. 'Tis not right. They're all judging me and looking down their noses at me. Please make them leave. Why can't we spend the rest of the night, just you and I?" Hayden's brows came together in an irritated frown. "Why, Sadie, I can't do that. Besides, hiding will just make those women talk more." Resigned, Sadie let him drag her back to the ball, but she felt as if everyone were looking at her, as if she were a child who had behaved badly. She stayed by Hayden's side until he lost his patience. "Sadie, stop trailing me like a toddler," he whispered to her tartly and pushed her away softly. "You don't see any of the other women sticking to their husbands, now do you?" Sadie started, and her words caught in her throat when he just turned his back to her. The young girl stared from him to the others, horrified, and then eventually withdrew, full of shame. Even though Mrs. Fitzgerald was a friendly woman and did not seem to judge her, Sadie did not enjoy her tea party. She sat with the other women and listened politely, bored by the recurrent topics of the upcoming hunts in autumn and polo and cricket games, which seemed to be their husbands' main occupations during the summer. Sadie put in a comment when expected to, stunning everyone by admitting that she had never sat on a horse or never watched a game before, but if anyone had asked her what they had actually talked about that afternoon, she would not have been able to tell. "Well, ladies, I am certainly too old to play, but shan't we all move to the terrace and enjoy ourselves with a game of badminton?" The other ladies were thrilled, and the younger ones insisted Sadie play too. The young girl watched curiously as the first 4 players skipped down to the field, rackets in hands, and started hitting the feathery ball from one side of the net to the other. "Sadie," someone called from the field, "come on, it's your turn." The young girl was glad to flee from her host and found delight in the game. She played until she was out of breath and her dress stuck to her perspiring body. Sadie staggered to the side of the field, panting, and took off her sun hat to wipe her forehead. Her eyes trailed to the terrace and she noticed that someone had joined the group. "Oh no," her partner muttered. "What is she doing here?" Sadie squinted, and after a few seconds she recognized Countess Markievicz. "Another round?" Sadie's partner asked, but the young girl shook her head. "I'll skip this one." She headed back to the group, hoping to catch the Countess's eye. "Sadie, have you met Constance yet?" Mrs. Fitzgerald asked. The Countess raised her head to the young girl, and her lips hinted a smile in greeting, which made her features softer and her light eyes friendlier. "I haven't had the chance," Sadie said, and sat down at the table. She filled a glass with iced tea and drank in small sips, relishing the cold, sweet-flavored liquid that eased the dryness in her throat. Sadie's eyes peered at Countess Markievicz over the brim of the glass, and the young girl inconspicuously scrutinized her. The Countess had a square face with high cheekbones and a prominent nose. Thin lips formed a straight line above a round, jutting chin. She had a thick mass of brown hair, and Sadie realized that they were not actually cut short, but arranged in a way that only suggested it. She wondered if the Countess had done so on purpose. Despite her slightly masculine traits, Constance's face had something warm to it, and Sadie decided that she liked her. It was apparent that the other women did not enjoy the Countess's company, and after a while they deserted the terrace for various reasons, so that in the end Sadie found herself alone with Constance. "I was told you are an admirer of Yeats," the Countess said. Sadie's eyes grew wide in veneration. "Oh, I love his work. Haydn has a collection in his study," Sadie replied, and remembered fondly that it had been Miss Emma to first introduce her to the Irish author's books. "Why, did you know he's a friend of mine?" "You know him?" Sadie wondered. "I do. I shall introduce you someday, if I get the chance." "Sure, and I'd love that." Constance studied the girl. Her cheeks were still flushed from being hot, but the sweat pearls on her large forehead had dried. The sun had given her skin a tender blush, her nose being so red that the sunburn had eclipsed the freckles sprinkling it. There was a twinkle in Sadie's dreamy brown eyes. "Are you interested in politics?" the Countess asked carefully. "Well, I don't know much about it," Sadie admitted, and looked at Constance sheepishly. "I don't even know what the Daughters of Ireland are." Constance gave a hearty laugh and smiled fondly at the young girl. "I could talk about that all day, but let's just say that we fight for the rights and freedom of the Irish." Constance watched as Sadie's expression faltered. The latter's eyes grew distant, and she wondered what the young girl was thinking about, or who. "What do you know about Ireland's history?" Sadie's eyes flickered back to Countess Markievicz, and her embarrassment deepened. "They didn't teach us much at the orphanage, and my tutor is not inclined to talk about it." Constance's mouth twitched, and she nodded knowingly. "You should come and visit someday. We would have a lot to talk about, you and I. I've a feeling we could become very good friends." 1 week later, a package arrived for Sadie. The young girl was perplexed when the housekeeper came into the dining room after breakfast and announced that there was something in the mail for her. "I put it in your drawing room, madam." "Thank you, Mrs. Simon." Sadie still addressed the woman politely, while Haydn only called her Simon. The housekeeper did not seem impressed by Sadie's attempts to be friendly and treat her like an equal person. Now she just stared at her young mistress grimly and waited to be dismissed. Hayden looked up from his newspaper and watched both of them with a frown. Sadie was aware of his eyes on her and felt the need to add something. "Could you also set a bouquet of roses in my drawing room, please?" Mrs. Simon nodded curtly. "Yes, madam." "Thank you. That will be all, Simon," Hayden interjected, unnerved by his wife's cordialness. Sadie waited until the housekeeper had retreated, then went into her drawing room to find out what the package contained. She was surprised when she recognized the sender address as being Countess Markiewicz's. The package revealed a book by Yeats called Kathleen ni Julian, a play. As Sadie opened the cover, a note flew out and dropped to the ground. "I assumed your husband would not have this in his library. Constance." "What is it?" came Hayden's voice from behind. Sadie startled and instinctively closed the book as she whirled around to him. "'Tis just a small thought from someone I met at Mrs. Fitzgerald's the other day," she answered, staring at him with wide eyes and hoping he would not ask to see the book. Her husband raised his brows. "Is it now? A woman, I hope," he added teasingly, and laughed at his own joke. Sadie smiled crookedly, holding on to the book tightly so that the note would not slip out again. A pang of guilt hit the young girl as she looked at Hayden, for she did not like hiding something from him, but her instinct told her that it was better if her husband did not see the book and the note it had come with. Sadie sat by the open window and stared outside absently, her book resting in her lap. Raindrops pounded against the glass. The sweet scent of flowers and wet grass drifted into her drawing room. It was a warm, damp day, one of the last of the summer. Hayden passed in the hallway on his way to go out and stopped, frowning, when he glanced through the open door and saw his wife. "You're going to get wet," he remarked, and drew Sadie out of her reverie. She glanced at him. "'Tis all right, I don't mind," the young girl replied. Hayden was not satisfied with her answer. "What is the matter with you?" "Not?" He sighed. "Would you please not speak in that accent? You know I don't like it." Sadie turned to him, and Hayden was taken aback by the spiteful, defiant look that flashed in her eyes. She fixed him silently, unsettling him. Hayden pulled at the collar of his shirt and cleared his throat. "I'm off to the club. I will see you this evening." When he was gone, the young girl let out a deep sigh. Hayden had started irritating her. She had not noticed the subtle change in her nature, had not seen it coming, until at one point she had simply realized that her husband annoyed her. It angered her that he left her alone all day, and that in fact they led completely separate lives, even at night time, for he only seldom came to her bedroom, and if he did, he never stayed for the night. She was frustrated that she did not seem to be good enough for Hayden, but that on the other hand he liked showing her off in front of friends, the few he appeared to have, and acquaintances. His expectations exasperated her, his frequent mood swings emphasizing her feelings. Despite the rain, Sadie decided that she needed to get out of the oppressive house. She still considered it to be Hayden's home and not hers, and she felt like a guest that her husband tolerated when he was in a good mood. The young girl walked to the docks, reminiscing about the day Hayden had found her watching the ships. Today, she did not feel like staying here. Instead, a longing for the beach spread inside of her, a yearning to stand in the sand, her face turned to the water, and breathing in the salty wind swept in from the Irish Sea. She had not intended to choose the beach where Morgan had said goodbye to her, but nonetheless found herself headed south towards Sandymount. Her breath was quick after the long walk, but as she glimpsed the beach from a distance, Sadie found she ran out of it and slowed down her pace. Someone was playing the piano in one of the Henrian row houses along the road. A soft tune, the tact of which evoked both nostalgia and serenity. On Sadie's left, the heath gradually fell off into the sandbank. Far away, the ocean glittered in a few spots where rays of sun penetrated the heavy, slate-grey clouds. A few stray raindrops pattered down on Sadie's umbrella as the threatening clouds moved on silently and the sky lightened up. She left the road and stepped onto the beach, the seam of her dress leaving a trail in the sand. The tide was low, and the young girl walked along until her boots made murky sounds. Sadie stopped and gazed out at the sea. She closed her eyes for a moment, the calm of the ocean soothing to her spirit. When she opened them again, she saw a young man dressed in grey rags staring at her. He was tall, broad-shouldered. Wisps of curly, dark brown hair peered from underneath the cap he was wearing and fell across his large forehead, tickling his high cheekbones. His chin was pointy, giving his long face a masculine look. They froze, and time stood still with them. Sadie thought her legs would not carry her. She wondered if she had gone mad, if somehow her brain was playing a trick on her, for the figure she gaped at did not move for a long while. She felt transported to another time, as if it had just been yesterday that she had seen him. If he had grown, if he had become muscular and more mature, she did not notice. Then he walked towards her slowly. "Morgan," Sadie murmured, amazed, and tilted her face up to him when he closed in on her. Her brown eyes gleamed with a familiar tenderness that made Morgan's heart beat quicker. "Hello to you too." He grinned and studied her curiously. Her face had lost some of its innocent youth. Her mouth was set into a line hinting that she was not happy with her life. Her eyes had become wiser, and the chubby cheeks he had so liked to pinch had receded. She had become a woman in those 3 years he had been gone. Morgan moved under the umbrella with Sadie and gazed down at her. She felt dizzy by his closeness, yet she was unable to draw back. "How long have you been home?" the young girl asked, and avoided his intense gaze, her cheeks flushing. He was standing so close she could feel his warm breath caress her forehead. "Not long." His scent, mixed with the smell of the ocean, woke a giddiness inside of her, which assailed her and made her head spin. Morgan silently willed her to look up at him, and when she finally did, she found the same expression in his cloudy green eyes. "You look different," she said, studying his short beard and mustache. "So, have you seen the world?" Morgan smiled sadly. "I've seen all of Ireland, didn't make it to the other places yet." "Why not?" He hesitated. "I wanted to come back." Sadie's heart skipped a beat. She swallowed, aware that her throat had suddenly gone dry. The arm that had held up her umbrella twitched before it sank. The breeze swept into Sadie's face, playing with the loose strands of her fox-red hair. Morgan felt the urge to stroke it out of her face. "You never said goodbye," Sadie croaked. "I couldn't." He touched her hand lightly. A jolt of electricity bolted through his body, and the young man impulsively leaned down to Sadie. All of a sudden, someone called out to Sadie, "Good morning, Mrs. King." Both of them startled. Sadie drew in her breath and bounded a step back. She whirled around, confused, and stared at an elderly man whom she did not recognize. She smiled feebly and watched as the man walked by without glancing at her again. "King?" The young girl turned back to Morgan and saw that his expression had hardened. I got married a while back," Sadie replied, and avoided his piercing eyes. "You married?" Morgan repeated, dumbfounded. Then his eyes lost their light, as if the sun no longer reflected itself in them. "And you married to Hayden King?" The young girl did not notice his sarcastic tone. "You know him?" she asked in surprise. Morgan laughed out scornfully. "Who doesn't? He owns everything and everyone in this town and outside." Sadie flinched at his gruffness. "What?" The young man studied her, then gave another short laugh. "You don't even know. Jesus, you're married to the guy. How can you not be aware of that?" "Of what?" Sadie called out impatiently. Hayden King is one of the richest men in town. He owns the factory outside of Dublin, several properties throughout the city, which he rents, and he owns land in County Waterford, County Cork, and County Limerick. Sadie stared at Morgan as if he had slapped her. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Where do you think your money comes from, Sadie? From honest work? He doesn't know what that word means. He's inherited his fortune, Sadie replied to Hayden's defense. She tried to remember what people had said of Hayden before she married him. His father had made money investing in tea trading in Ceylon. His grandfather had been landowner in Ireland, just like their ancestors. The young girl blinked at Morgan, whose anger seeped through his eyes like ink tainting a glass of water. I've seen things while I was away, he said quietly, almost threateningly, and she was shocked by the ire that mixed in his hoarse voice. I know how this world works. 'Tis ruled by the English. It has been for hundreds of years. A chilly wind had come up and tugged relentlessly at Sadie's hair, slapping her face like a cold, wet towel. She wondered if the young man standing before her was the same person she had been cherishing in her memories for 3 years, or if she had fooled herself into believing he was someone else. She wondered if Morgan had always been so bitter. I have to go, Sadie said, distraught. You know, I would never have thought that someday he would become like them, Morgan threw in. And to marry him? He's almost 20 years older than you. What could you possibly see in him? Or did you marry him for his money? Is that what you are? His words hurt her. No! You're just like him, Sadie. You have everything, while others have not, and I'm sure you don't even care. Stop it! You don't know me anymore. You don't know me, Sadie shouted, suddenly despaired. Then look around you. Your world is a farce, a facade blinding you to what's really happening. Dublin is filled with people living in horrible conditions. They all depend on your beloved husband, but he's too busy hoarding money and spending it for himself. What are you talking about? Morgan's breath came hard. His shoulders heaved. He had stepped back, putting distance between him and Sadie. The poor are starving, working themselves to death to pay rents they can't afford. People like your husband are responsible for that. They stand by and do nothing. Every day children starve into ill health, and your husband and his kind are the murderers. Sadie was trembling now. Morgan's eyes were lifeless. Those children, that was us, Sadie. That's why I left, remember? The poor have no future. You once were one of us, Sadie. Don't you forget where you come from. Morgan stalked past her and left her standing on the beach. Sadie turned around and looked at his back, ready to cry. When his frame had shrunk, the young girl ran her hand across her eyes and faced the ocean, but even its gentle murmur could not soothe her now. Morgan stomped off and felt boiling inside. He could have expected that she had married, that she had not been waiting for him. After all, he had never asked her to. But deep down, he had hoped to find things as they had been before. He had come back for her. He had wanted to tell her that for the past 3 years he had not stopped thinking about her, that he wanted her by his side. He wanted to take her to all those beautiful places he had seen, then go to America and start a new life with her, start a family together. What a fool he had been. It was time to let go of the past.